A lonely millionaire found her in the rain, without imagining she would change his life. The streets of Manhattan seemed more like a mirage than a city that night. The pavement gleamed with water, the golden lights of the street lamps trembled reflected in the puddles, and the cold air bit the skin like invisible needles. The rain wouldn't stop, thick drops falling with an almost cruel cadence on the hunched shoulders of those who still dared to walk. But he wasn't one of them. Alexander Hawthorne walked upright, hands in the pockets of his black coat, as if the rain didn't exist, as if nothing could touch him anymore. It was late, too late for anyone who had someone waiting at home, but Alexander had no one. The echo of his shoes on the stones resonated like a heart that no longer knew how to beat to the rhythm of anything. He had lost count of nights like this, wandering aimlessly, fleeing from the cold penthouse he inherited when he no longer had anyone to share it with. They had told him all his life that being a Hawthorne was a privilege, but what he felt wasn't privilege. It was a weight he didn't know how to remove from his shoulders. At the intersection of two narrow streets in the village, something forced him to stop. It wasn't a sound or a word. It was a tremor. There in the middle of the wet asphalt, a figure knelt over a dark puddle, small, barely a silhouette among the shadows, with hair stuck to her face by the rain and arms firmly closed around a worn leather satchel. Alexander looked at her for a few seconds, trying to convince himself she was just another lost soul in the city. But when she lifted her head and looked back at him, something cracked inside him. Her eyes, two restless amber flames, pierced through him with an impossible mixture of pride and fear. She wasn't asking for help, but she wasn't completely rejecting it either, and that unsettled him. In all the years he had spent rubbing shoulders with women in designer dresses and practiced smiles, he had never seen a look like that, alive, stubborn, and yet broken inside. He took a step toward her, almost without realizing it. The young woman straightened up slightly, defiant. Her body shivered under the rain, but she didn't move from her spot. Alexander slowly removed a black leather glove and put it in his pocket. Then, he opened the umbrella he hadn't even deployed for himself until that moment. He leaned toward her, and in silence, extended his hand, offering her the shelter of the umbrella. She looked at him with distrust. For a second her lips pressed together, as if she were about to refuse. But the rain, relentless, continued soaking her clothes and chilling her bones. Finally, in an almost imperceptible gesture, she accepted. Her trembling fingers brushed his when she took the umbrella handle, and in that minimal contact, Alexander felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. A heavy silence enveloped them, while the rain continued beating the umbrella violently. Alexander didn't know why he had done that, nor why he wasn't leaving yet. He only knew that this woman, this stranger, with dark and rebellious eyes, had just become something impossible to ignore. And if you want to keep listening to stories where souls meet under the rain, subscribe so you don't miss any. The young woman looked away toward the ground, murmuring something he couldn't hear, but her soft and tired voice remained suspended between them, like a secret. And that night, under the rain, Alexander Hawthorne had his first certainty in years. His life had just changed, though he didn't know it yet. The cafe smelled of freshly baked croissants and warm steam when they entered. The rain continued beating the fogged windows, and the soft murmur of conversations from other few customers faded before the sense of refuge the place offered. Alexander held the door for her to go first. The young woman, with the satchel clutched against her chest and clothes still dripping, hesitated before crossing the threshold, as if she feared that gesture of hospitality would cost more than she was willing to pay. They chose a table in a secluded corner. Alexander ordered 2 lattes, without asking if she wanted one. When the steaming cup arrived, she looked at it cautiously, but after a few seconds, she wrapped it between her cold hands, closing her eyes as she felt the warmth. He wasn't watching her directly, but couldn't help noticing how her shoulders, tense like strings, gradually relaxed. "You don't have to do this," she finally murmured, with a raspy and low voice, almost as if speaking to herself. Alexander looked up. The young woman continued avoiding his eyes. "It's nothing," he responded calmly, slowly turning the cup between his hands. She then raised her gaze. And there they were again, those intense eyes with the same defiant fire that had made him stop on the street. He noticed she was studying him with the same curiosity with which he had studied her. In that silent crossing, neither of them yielded. His gaze fell on the satchel, old, worn in several places, as if it were the only thing that had survived too many storms. Without thinking, Alexander asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated before answering, as if even her name were too big a secret to share. "Seraphina." The word floated in the air between them, musical, ethereal. "Seraphina." "Alexander," he said almost without realizing he was saying it. She nodded slightly, as if she had known from the beginning. Then she leaned over the cup and took a long sip of coffee. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was dense, full of unasked questions. When they finished, Alexander asked for the check and paid it without discussion. He got up, and for a moment, hesitated whether he should offer to take her somewhere, but she stepped forward, hanging the satchel over her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, and then with that single word, she turned and walked toward the door. He followed her with his gaze as her silhouette was lost again under the rain, her dark hair sticking to her face like a curtain. Something inside him screamed not to let her go, to stop her, to ask where she was going, what she needed, if she had a place to sleep, but his feet remained still. He didn't know what to do with that new sensation she had left in his chest, that pang that was neither entirely pain nor entirely hope. Alexander left the cafe a few minutes later. Outside, the night remained equally relentless, and although he searched with his gaze through the deserted streets, he didn't find her. He returned home alone, as always. But that night, something had changed in the cold air of the penthouse when he closed the door behind him. The image of Seraphina, with her soaked hair, and that stubborn look was still there, as if she had entered with him without permission. In the silence of his bedroom, Alexander sat on the edge of the bed and brought his hands to his face. That strange sensation in his chest wouldn't fade. The rain continued beating the windows, and for the first time in years he wished someone were there to share it with him. Seraphina, a name that now beat inside him with a force he didn't understand. The penthouse was in shadows when Alexander arrived. The rain continued falling outside, as if the clouds were endless, and the stillness of that place was heavier than ever. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city lights below, and the modern furniture stood like silent sentinels in the darkness. He sank into one of the leather chairs in the main living area, and looked around. Cold fireplace, empty wine glasses on the marble table, a designer clock that wouldn't stop marking the hours like a cruel reminder. He took out his phone, and without thinking too much, opened the contact app. But of course there was no Seraphina on his list. He closed it with a frustrated sigh. Why did he care so much? Why had that mysterious woman, with her worn satchel and proud eyes, left that mark on his chest? His mind tried to convince him it was nothing, that it had barely been a rainy night, and an impulsive gesture. He wasn't one of those who let themselves be carried away by passing emotions, but emotions don't ask for permission, and his that night was claiming its space, refusing to dissipate. He got up and walked to his study. There on the glass desk was a silver-framed photograph. He took it in his hands, and looked at it in silence. It was his sister Evangeline, smiling under an umbrella just like the one he had offered Seraphina that same night. He remembered the last time he had seen her, before a car accident cut her life short too soon. He remembered the promise he had made to himself then, never to need anyone again, never again, and yet here he was, remembering another person's gaze under the rain. He closed his eyes, and let the frame fall gently onto the desk. He decided that sensation wouldn't defeat him, that by morning he would erase it from his mind, as he had done so many other times with so many other things that hurt. But when he went to bed, he found no rest. He tossed and turned between the silk sheets, with Seraphina's image pursuing him through dreams. Her soaked hair, the way her hands trembled when they took the umbrella, the way her eyes seemed to tell him, "I don't need your help, but please, don't let go of me yet." When sleep finally overcame him, The rain continued resonating against the windows, and in his mind, the certainty that this young woman had come to disorder everything could no longer be denied, because although he told himself otherwise, Alexander knew he wanted to see her again, and that deep down, he was no longer capable of continuing to live as if no one mattered to him. That night, for the first time in years, he dreamed of someone, and that someone was called Seraphina. The next morning brought a gray sky, heavy, although the rain had ceased. Alexander woke early, something unusual for him, with a single thought crossing his mind: Seraphina. He tried to distract himself with the usual routines, business calls, reports. His assistant had left on the desk, but the words seemed irrelevant, distant. By mid-morning, his steps led him, almost by inertia, to downtown Manhattan. He stopped in front of the same cafe where he had taken her the night before, but the corner where she had sat was empty, and the steam from other customers' cups told him nothing. He had no plan, didn't know where to look for her, but he also couldn't resign himself to not trying. He wandered through the streets, walking aimlessly. It was then that, turning down a narrow avenue in Soho, something caught his attention. In front of a small weathered flower shop, a familiar silhouette was trying to arrange a bucket of fresh carnations on a makeshift table on the sidewalk. It was her, Seraphina. She wore the same simple jacket from the night before, her hair pulled back in a hurried bun, and the satchel, faithful companion, at her feet. Her expression was concentrated, serious, as if those flower bouquets were the last thing she had left in life, and she wasn't planning to give up. Alexander stopped, leaning against the corner of a building, simply watching her. There was something hypnotic in the way that, despite the fatigue that could be glimpsed in her gestures, she cared for each flower with delicacy, as if each one deserved her attention. When she finished arranging her improvised stand, she sat on a small stool, intertwined her hands over her knees, and remained waiting for the first customers. The morning advanced slowly, and it didn't seem like many were stopping to buy something from her. Alexander couldn't help a crooked smile. The dignity she exuded, even in that situation, was almost unbearable for someone like him. He walked toward her with sure steps, and stopped in front of the small stand. "Good morning," he said softly. Seraphina looked up, surprised, and her eyebrows frowned slightly upon recognizing him. She said nothing, but that spark in her eyes was intact. Alexander looked at the flowers for a few seconds. Then he took a bill from the inner pocket of his jacket and pointed to the carnations. "I'll take them all." She blinked, astonished, and immediately shook her head, looking down. "I don't need your money," she murmured, her voice charged with a mixture of pride and distrust. "It's not charity," he responded calmly. "It's business. You sell flowers. I buy them." Seraphina looked at him, fixedly. For an instant, the tension between them became so dense that the bustle of the street seemed to fade. Finally, she sighed, stood up and began collecting the flowers, one by one, arranging them in a cardboard box. "They're $25, she said with a firm voice, as if each word were a declaration of independence. Alexander paid the exact amount, and added nothing more. He took the box with the flowers, and looked at her one last time before leaving. But as he walked away a few steps, without even turning around, he threw one last phrase to the wind. "Don't disappear again." Seraphina remained there, motionless, with her eyes fixed on his back as he was lost among the crowd. That afternoon, for the first time, Alexander brought fresh flowers to his penthouse, and for the first time in a long time, the place didn't seem so cold to him. The fresh flowers filled the penthouse with an unexpected aroma. Alexander had left them on the main table in the entrance hall, without even bothering to look for an adequate vase. He stood for a few seconds looking at them, feeling how the color of the carnations, deep red, like an open wound, contrasted with the monotony of the gray walls. And for the first time in years, he felt that solemn silence was no longer enough for him. He spent the night awake, walking from one end of his study to the other, thinking. The next morning, with the first ray of sun filtering through the curtains, he made a quick call. A few hours later, he was again in front of the flower shop on the corner. Seraphina was there, as if she had never moved from her small stand, with the same cold hands and the same defiant look. She saw him arrive, but didn't get up. Alexander stopped in front of her, and put his hands in his pockets. "I want to make you a proposal," he said directly. Seraphina arched an eyebrow, impatient. "I'm not interested in any favor," she answered coldly. "It's not a favor, it's a job." She looked at him in silence, evaluating his words. Alexander continued, "I have a garden that's been neglected for years. I could hire any company to fix it, but I prefer someone who understands flowers and doesn't treat them like merchandise." Seraphina let out a small ironic laugh, and shook her head. "Shh, you follow me to hire me as a gardener?" Alexander nodded, impassive. "If you want to call it that." She looked down, playing with a stem between her fingers. It was obvious the idea made her uncomfortable, but it was also evident she needed the money. After a long silence, she finally responded, "All right, but don't look at me with pity." "Not once." Alexander narrowed his eyes, as if that condition were as absurd as it was understandable. "I won't." That same afternoon Seraphina crossed for the first time the iron gate of the Hawthorne estate in the Hamptons. Her small and discreet figure seemed swallowed by the magnitude of the place. She walked with short steps, with the satchel hanging from one shoulder and her hair carelessly pulled back. When she entered the back garden, she stopped dead. Before her stretched a vast terrain devoured by weeds, with dry fountains and rose bushes covered in thorns and dust. It was a space that once must have been beautiful, but now was nothing more than a reflection of the abandonment that inhabited its owner. Seraphina left the satchel on a bench and walked through the garden slowly, touching the dry leaves with her fingers, pulling weeds as she passed. There was something in her way of walking, of looking at the withered flowers, that reminded Alexander of what he felt when he saw her that night under the rain. That mixture of fragility and strength. He watched her from the living room window with a glass in his hand, and although he wouldn't admit it out loud, seeing her there leaning over the wet earth, giving life back to something he had given up for lost, provoked a strange sensation in him. It was as if, somehow, Seraphina wasn't only unearthing the dry roots of the garden, but also his own. When evening fell, she collected her tools and headed to the door. Alexander reached her in the hall. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. She looked him in the eyes and responded with the same determination as always, "Yes, and every day that's necessary." Alexander nodded, satisfied, but when the door closed behind her, he couldn't help leaning against the frame, and staying there for a while, looking at the garden that was still yet to bloom. Something in his chest told him that not only the flowers would return to sprout, the days began to succeed each other like pages of a book someone finally decided to read. Every morning, Seraphina arrived punctually, with the satchel over her shoulder and hair pulled back in a hurried braid, and every afternoon she left with hands stained with earth, but with her head held high. Alexander, at first, watched her from a distance, from the balcony, from the windows, from the living room, with a half-empty glass in his hand, but little by little, his presence stopped being silent. On the third day, he went down to the garden to offer her water. She accepted it without looking at him too much. On the fifth, he dared to ask how she planned to rescue those rose bushes covered in thorns. On the sixth, he found himself crouched next to her, listening carefully, as she explained the difference between pruning with care, or pulling with anger. And by the end of the second week, it was impossible to pretend they weren't talking about something more than flowers. "This garden is like you," Seraphina told him one afternoon, with her hands buried in the earth, without looking up. Alexander looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. She just smiled barely, like someone who leaves a seed, and doesn't expect it to germinate immediately. The days passed, and the penthouse began to fill with small changes: a fresh bouquet in the entrance hall, the soft aroma of lavender in the hallway, a new bench under the lemon tree, where sometimes he found her resting. The staff noticed it, but didn't dare say anything. The house seemed less cold. Sometimes when evening fell, and golden light flooded the garden, Alexander would stay watching her while she worked, wondering what else that woman was capable of transforming with her hands, because she was also changing him. Slowly, with the patience of someone who knows flowers don't open suddenly. One afternoon, while Seraphina collected the tools, Alexander stood observing her worn satchel, the same one from that night under the rain, the same one she never let go. "Why do you always carry it with you?" he dared to ask. She looked up, surprised, her eyes softened, as if that question had touched something delicate. "Because it's the only thing of mine that no one has taken from me yet," she responded, without more. Alexander felt a knot in his throat, but didn't insist, and in the silence that followed, he understood he wasn't the only one afraid of losing the little he had. That night, as he watched her leave through the gate, he thought about how everything in his life had been possession, contracts, signed papers. Seraphina wasn't. Seraphina was free, and that was what most attracted him, and most frightened him at the same time. The first flowers of the garden began to open at the end of the third week. The white and red petals seemed to celebrate the persistence of the hands that had cared for them. That morning, Alexander stopped next to her in front of the largest rose bush, and noticed how the sunlight caressed her face. "It's more beautiful than I remembered," he murmured. Seraphina looked at him sideways, and smiled, barely, with modesty. "Flowers only need a little love, the same as people." The words remained floating in the air between them, so soft and certain that Alexander didn't know what to respond. And as evening fell, he knew he no longer only wanted her to fix the garden, he wanted her to stay, although he still didn't know how to ask her. "And have you ever met someone who changed your life little by little, without you noticing? Tell us in the comments. We want to read you." The invitation arrived one morning, on a thick envelope, with the family seal stamped in wax. A charity ball in the main ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, the same one that every year brought together the most prominent figures of New York. Alexander wasn't a man who usually attended that type of event lately, but that time when he read the date, and felt Seraphina's curious gaze over his shoulder while she arranged a bouquet in the entrance hall, something inside him pushed him to say, "I want you to come with me." Seraphina, surprised, turned with her hands full of flowers.
"Oh, me see?"
she asked, incredulous. "You?" She hesitated, insecure, looked down and played with the petals. She had never been involved in anything like that. Fear shone in her eyes, but he insisted, with a firm voice, "You don't have to be like them, you just have to be by my side." That's how. 2 nights later, Alexander waited on the mansion's staircase while Seraphina slowly came down wearing a simple dress, borrowed from one of the staff. Her hair loose, hands gripped on a small purse. She looked nervous, like a child learning to walk on a stage. But when he saw her, something inside him softened. She was beautiful, in a disarming, authentic way. The hotel ballroom was full of warm lights and elegant music. Rich and well-dressed couples walked around with champagne glasses in hand, greeting with compromised smiles. Alexander led her by the arm with sure steps, as if his mere presence were enough to protect her from the stares. But Seraphina felt them equally. Those invisible eyes that examined her from head to toe, the muffled giggles when she passed, the whispers behind silk fans. She noticed it, and each comment seemed to stick another thorn in her skin. At first she tried to ignore it, focus only on Alexander, on the music, on the sweet aromas of the ballroom, but when she clearly heard a couple of women whispering, "Who is that? Surely another one of his adventures, and look how she's dressed. Poor thing." Her cheeks burned with shame, the glass she had in her hand trembled, and her lips pressed together. Alexander looked at her sideways, and noticed how her forced smile was breaking little by little. "Are you okay?" he murmured, worried. She breathed deeply, trying to maintain composure, but couldn't anymore. She left the glass on a nearby waiter's tray, and took a step back. "I'm sorry, I have to get out of here," she said in a low voice, without daring to look him in the eyes. Before he could react, Seraphina was already turning, moving away through the crowd, walking quickly toward the exit with her head down. Alexander felt how something inside him broke seeing her flee like that, like a flower plucked before its time. He followed her to the hotel entrance, but by the time he crossed the doors, he saw her getting lost in the square, under a light drizzle that had begun to fall. The rain was finding her first again, always her. Alexander stood still, under the lintel, with clenched fists and a cold anger growing in his chest. Anger against all those who had made her feel less, and against himself for not having protected her better. For the first time in a long time, he didn't care what others would say. For the first time in years, his heart screamed louder than his head. He went out after her. The rain soaked his hair, his jacket, his shoes, but none of that mattered. He wanted her back, not just for the garden, not just for the flowers. He wanted her back, because in her he had found something he was no longer willing to lose. If this moment also touched your heart, give this story a like, and stay with us until the end. The square was deserted at that hour, only a light drizzle painting the stones silver, and the hollow sound of his own hurried steps. Alexander turned his head at every corner, looking for that silhouette he knew so well. Finally he saw her. She was sitting alone on a bench at the end of the esplanade, with her hands covering her face, and the satchel between her feet, motionless, soaked to the bone. Alexander approached slowly. Each drop of rain hitting his back was a cruel reminder of what he had allowed to happen in there. The woman he most desired in the world was there, feeling small, hurt, displaced because of him. Seraphina looked up when she felt his presence. Her eyes were bright with tears, but not the kind that fall sweetly, but those that are contained by pure pride. "Leave me alone," she said with a thread of voice, without strength. Alexander stood still in front of her, soaked like a child under the rain, refusing to back down. "No," he responded simply, with that low and stubborn voice she had already learned to recognize. Seraphina looked away and hugged herself. "I don't fit in your world," she said bitterly. "I'm not like them. I never will be." The words hurt him more than her. Alexander crouched in front of her, lowering his head to look her in the eyes, even though she tried to avoid them. "I don't want you to be like them," he said slowly. "I don't want another mask in my life. I want someone who's not afraid to pull out the thorns." She blinked, confused. "Why me?" she murmured, her voice broken. Alexander took a deep breath, as if those words had been waiting in his chest forever. "Because with you, there's nothing empty. Because with you I feel again. Because since that night when I saw you in the rain, I didn't know how to be the same again." The silence became thick between them, broken only by the monotonous beating of rain on the puddles. Seraphina looked at him, finally, her eyes clouded but alive, full of questions, of fear, and of something deeper she still didn't dare to name. Alexander extended his hand, open, as he had done that first night under the storm. "Please," he whispered, "don't run away again." She looked at him for a long time, tears now sliding down her cheeks, and little by little, with a timid but decided gesture, she put her hand over his. The contact was like a silent promise. He helped her get up and surrounded her with his coat, protecting her from the cold while he guided her back. They walked together under the rain, slowly, without saying anything more. Suddenly the whole world around disappeared. There were no cruel whispers from the ballroom left, no echoes of the past, only two lonely souls who for the first time had found each other completely. When they arrived at the mansion, Alexander led her to the back garden, where the flowers she herself had revived still resisted the storm, each one upright in its place like a symbol of patience and strength. Seraphina looked at that garden, and understood that her work had been more than sowing and pruning. She had given Alexander back something he didn't know he was looking for a reason. He looked at her tenderly, and although no words came from his lips, their intertwined fingers spoke for both of them. That night, while the rain gradually ceased, he knew he would never let her escape again. The days that followed were marked by a different rhythm. The mansion, which had been cold and silent for years, began to fill with life little by little. Every morning, Seraphina walked with Alexander to the garden, no longer with the uncomfortable distance from before. Now he waited for her on the staircase, with 2 cups of hot coffee and a complicit gesture, as if that were their new ritual. The garden bloomed at a speed that surprised everyone. The fountains, once dry and covered with dust, now overflowed with clear water, surrounded by white lilies and carefully pruned bushes. The roses had returned to open in all their fullness, perfuming the air with a sweet and fresh aroma that filtered through the windows to the interior of the house. But it wasn't just the garden that had changed. Alexander was changing too in everyone's eyes. It showed in the way he smiled when he saw her bent among the plants, in how he followed her with his gaze while she placed flowers in the entrance hall vases, in how he waited for her every night by the door to make sure she didn't leave without saying goodbye. She, for her part, no longer walked with the same rigidity as the first days. Her satchel continued hanging from her shoulder, but now it seemed lighter. More and more, Seraphina dared to joke with him while they worked together, and even sometimes she let escape a frank laugh that resonated in the empty corridors of the mansion, like an impossible echo to ignore. One afternoon, Alexander stopped in the center of the garden, watching her while she collected fallen petals from the rose bushes. The sunlight bathed her hair, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to stop. He walked toward her in silence, and when Seraphina raised her gaze, she found in his eyes something she had never seen in anyone. Gratitude. Seraphina, Alexander murmured, taking her gently by the hand. She looked at him, confused, but didn't pull hers away. You didn't just save this garden, he said, lowering his voice. You saved me. She blinked, feeling a knot in her throat. For so long she had repeated to herself that she didn't need anyone, that her own hands were enough to sustain her world, and now, in his, she understood she could also let herself be sustained. That afternoon dinner wasn't in the cold and distant dining room, but in the garden, under the stars. A small table, a bottle of wine, and the aroma of flowers around. They spoke little, but no more was needed. It was enough to be together, sharing that peace they had never found anywhere else. When night fell completely, Alexander accompanied her to the door. Before opening it, he stopped her with a soft touch on her arm. You don't have to leave, if you don't want to, he whispered. With a thread of voice that revealed more fear than he wanted to show, Seraphina looked at him for a long time, with tenderness, and then smiled. Not yet, she responded softly, but tomorrow I'll come back. And so, while he watched her leave under the tenuous moonlight, Alexander understood that life was made of small tomorrows that together formed an eternity. That night, for the first time he slept deeply, and upon waking, the first thing he thought of was her. Spring arrived without making noise, and with it a garden that was no longer the same. Flowers sprouted in all corners, fountains sang with their clear water, and the stone paths shone clean and covered with petals. The air was impregnated with lavender, jasmine, and that unmistakable aroma of wet earth after rain. That morning, Alexander woke earlier than usual. He walked to the large window, and opened the curtains to let the light of a warm sun bathe the room. The silence of the mansion no longer weighed as before. It was another silence, lighter, like a fulfilled promise. Seraphina was waiting for him in the garden, standing next to the lemon tree that was now full of small green fruits. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair loose in the wind, and that barely insinuated smile he had learned to read better than any book. Seeing him approach, she turned and looked at him with a tenderness that burned his chest. I didn't think you'd wake up so early, she said, with that voice that still disarmed him every time. I didn't think a garden could be more beautiful than an entire mansion, he responded, stopping in front of her, with his hands in his pockets. Seraphina laughed softly and looked away, as always when she felt he was saying too much without words. They walked together among the flowers, stopping here and there to admire a particularly full rose bush, or to carefully pull a dry branch that resisted the new season. Alexander didn't stop looking at her for an instant. She was no longer just his gardener, not even just his refuge. She was his home. At one point, she stopped and pointed to a small wooden bench at the back, next to the largest fountain. He followed her, and they sat one next to the other, in silence. The breeze played with her hair, and a ray of sun filtered through the trees. illuminating her as if the whole world conspired, so he couldn't look away. "I never thought I'd feel something like this again," he said, finally, with a thread of voice. Seraphina looked at him sideways, arching barely an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like this," he sighed, searching for words. "Like someone had given me back my life." She didn't respond. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes while her fingers searched for his. The contact was soft, natural, as if they had been destined to intertwine from the beginning. They stayed like that, listening to the murmur of water, the distant song of birds and the wind stirring the flowers. For the first time in years, Alexander felt that time owed him nothing, that everything he had lost somehow had been to lead him to that instant. On that bench with Seraphina by his side, the lonely millionaire who once walked under the rain, felt he had finally found a place to stay. When she raised her gaze, her eyes shone with a mixture of peace and certainty, and he smiled, a full smile, the first true one in a long time. "Seraphina," he said, lowering his voice, "stay, forever." She looked at him for a long time, and then nodded. "I already stayed," she responded, with that serenity of hers that seemed capable of healing everything. The bells of the nearby church sounded in the distance, announcing a new day, while they embraced under the shade of the lemon trees. And so in the heart of that reborn garden, Alexander finally understood what it meant to bloom after the storm. Because sometimes, all one needs to change their life is to find someone who's not afraid to stay when it rains the most. And if you want more stories, where rain ends in hope, subscribe and join us in each new chapter.